Good afternoon, folks. How are you?
I don't remember that.
Good. Nice to see you all. It's great to see some great faces. Our friends from Improvement Science, our friends from our Leadership Academy, and all of our friends from our Graduate School Center here. Thank you all so, so much. We're so happy to have you. We have two dear people on this stage. Many of you know both of them already by reputation and experience, but Larry Rosenstock and Deborah Meier. When we started putting these events together, we were trying to, be in service of you and thinking about where everyone in these audience are coming from different perspectives and how do we convene around education and progressive education and where do we go now? And so in light of everything that's happening in the world, we're really honored to have Larry and Deborah here to talk about where they've been. They've been together in work for about 30, 40 years. I won't say maybe longer, yeah. Basically playing and disrupting education for a long time together. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Larry, who's going to get us going. And we'll have about an hour or so today. There are some snacks over there. And we will be recording. Brent is in here somewhere recording. So thank you all for showing up. And we're going to be eagerly waiting for your questions at some point this afternoon, too. So thank you all. Please give a round of applause to Larry and Debbie.
Well, we're honored to have Debbie here. Since I'm here every day, I'm not sure how honorable that is, but you kind of wear thin after a while. But I've known Debbie for quite a few decades, as has Rob. And okay, I'm going to tell that story anyway because it is kind of fun. Why not?
It's not true.
It's not true. It's not true. This is a fantasy of my imagination when there was something called the North Dakota Study Group, which did not meet in North Dakota. That's me. Why? It did once. Okay, it met in Illinois, and about how many of us would go up there in the middle of the winter?
70.
About 70 people, and I was invited, and I was young, and I was thrilled to be invited. And I'd heard Debbie speak, and I ran into her alone in one hallway, and she said to me, not knowing me, she said, where are you going next? And I said, I'm going to where you're going next, because I like to watch you take things apart. And she kicked me in the shins, affectionately. And we went together. She doesn't remember that, but it's okay, I do.
I think she kicked me.
And then about 10 years ago, you were speaking in San Francisco to a really large group. It's about 1,200 people, a very large group. And I was asked to introduce her, and I was thrilled to be doing so. And so she was sitting among the audience, and I talked about the things that she's written and the things that she's done and the schools that she's done, and I mentioned that story. And she came up on the stage, and that time she did kick me in the shins, right? so kick me. So I am thrilled to be here with Debbie, and I'll begin the conversation, I think, with this. I have a collection of things that she's written that I give out. I've given out many of these things to many of you. The two favorites for me are the kindergarten tradition in the high school and the beautician question, can secondary education be progressive? The latter because I was a vocational teacher. So it's like it's a different version of the beautician question because in fact, Massachusetts banned beautician schools when Rob and I were there, because of the low pay in it and all that kind of stuff. But let's start with the kindergarten tradition in the high school, because you started in kindergarten and Rob and I started high school, and we worked ourselves down here to elementary schools, and you worked your way up to high schools. Why did you start in kindergarten? How did that happen, and what made you move up in grade level to high school?
Up and down are funny words, aren't they?
Yes, over and across, right.
Anyway, I actually, the very last thing I ever intended to do in my life, the very last, was
Good.
This way?
Yeah.
The very last thing I intended to do in my life was to be a teacher, much less a kindergarten teacher. And I grew up in the 30s and 40s, and my mother was a sort of what do you call them, a premature feminist, and she made absolutely clear that when I grew up I was supposed to do something important and serious, and certainly teaching elementary school was not important and not serious. And it was, that was what women always did when they couldn't do anything, weren't allowed to do anything else. And I also then went to Antioch College, and for a reason, because I wanted to would take a job in the same town as my uncle, an uncle I particularly loved. I took a job as a daycare center teacher in Indianapolis, and it confirmed, if anything needed to be confirmed, that little children were boring. And I wish their mothers would come here on time, and I wish when nap time came they would go to sleep so I wouldn't have to worry about them. In any case, so that was that. Then I had 3 children. I went to the University of Chicago, had 3 children, and my children, of course, were very interesting. It's funny that just those 3 were interesting. But anyway, and then I decided I was very involved in the civil rights movement and peace activities. This is the 50s and 60s. And my husband had a full-time job, and I thought I should bring a little money home. And so I decided to sub in Chicago's public schools. And I thought that would be easy, K through 8. That would be easy enough, and you made, I think, $25 a day or something. So if I did that 2 days a week, that would bring in $50. And I was used to being fairly good at things I did, and I just announced to you that I was a terrible substitute teacher. So bad sometimes that I would walk out of the class and tell the secretary of the building that the children would be safer if I left. So, but I learned something. It was my first experience really I had gone to a privileged private school in New York City, progressive private school, and it was my first experience in urban public education, and I was shocked at how shabbily teachers and children and parents were treated. I mean, I had never seen anything like that in my life, and I used to say to people, there was no time in my life that I was treated as disrespectfully as I was treated in Chicago schools. And there was clearly a pecking order. The secretary actually had a higher position than teachers because they could make life more difficult. I mean, the question of power had to do with who could make someone feel worse. You know, the principal could lord it over the teachers, and teachers could lord it over children, and children could lord it over younger children, and we could, all the school personnel could make parents miserable. And in any case, but I did it for a year as a kind of anthropological experience, and was fascinated. This was all over Chicago's South Side, and this was a tumultuous period in education also, and there was a lot of desegregation issues and fights going on, and Chicago was in the middle of it. And my children were starting school, and then the principal of the school that they were attending asked me whether I'd be interested in teaching morning kindergarten, and I thought that would probably be a little easier than subbing all over the city. And I fell in love with being a teacher. I found children absolutely fascinating. I'm not saying they're not also cute, but what intrigued me was that they were just as interesting as my own children. And that working as a kindergarten teacher was the most intellectually exciting experience of my life. I was excited about politics. I went to the University of Chicago in grad school and was getting a doctorate, but nothing I'd ever done was exciting as working amongst those 5-year-olds. And when we moved to Philadelphia, I taught the first year of Head Start, and to my surprise, 4-year-olds were exactly as interesting as 5-year-olds, if not more so. And when I came to New York, I taught in Harlem kindergarten, half-day kindergarten, for many years until someone named Tony Alvarado, who some of you may know because he came out to San Diego, said, would I like to start a school in East Harlem, and I could do whatever I wanted to do, and I could hire whoever I wanted to do it with. And in 1974, we started Central Park East, and somehow out of it grew 2 other, everybody said the kind of school you're talking about isn't good for those children. And that expression, those children, has remained as one of the most infuriating phrases because the assumption was that the kind of education I had gotten in a privileged private school wasn't good for them. We privileged children needed class sizes of 15 and 16, but it was perfectly okay if they had class sizes of 30, and so forth and so on, because somehow or other, those children didn't need the kind of things that I was accustomed to assuming all children needed. And certainly people said, you're never going to succeed in East Harlem because parents there won't want the kind of school that you're starting. And within 5 years, so many parents wanted to come to our school from East Harlem that we had to start 2 more schools called Central Park East 2 and River East. And then the parents started telling us that the kids complained when they left our school in 6th grade, and they said that school wasn't interesting anymore after they left our school. And why didn't we start a secondary school? So in 1985, we started a secondary school. And with the exception of 7th and 8th grade, I found secondary school students almost as interesting as 5-year-olds.
Did you have a distaste for high school students before you got to them?
I hadn't thought it would be interesting to teach. I had, because my model of what high school should be, even in a progressive high school, was not as interesting as the way we did our elementary school. We had mixed age groups. The rooms were not as wonderful as they are here, but they were filled with activities.
Right.
There was woodworking, and there was painting, and there was art, and there was sandbox. All the things that I thought belonged in a good kindergarten were in the good 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, and 6th grade. And when we got to starting a secondary school, I really wasn't sure what it could look like if we tried to keep that tradition.
And so I've always been affected by that sentence, the kindergarten tradition in the high school, and my take of it that was your feeling that high school should feel more like kindergartens. Can you say some more about that?
Well, I feel all of life should be more like kindergarten. Mm-hmm. And I've thought sometimes of starting an old people's home, and it should be like kindergarten. Too, my father was in one of those homes, and it infuriated me. They had these old people making pot holders because, I don't know, it was called occupational therapy.
Oh, yeah.
And people would, and here was my father, an extraordinarily distinguished and old man. He was supposed to make pot holders. And when they finished making the pot holders, since there was no purpose to it, they would take them apart so that they could make them again the next day. And so I think the kindergarten tradition is not only good for high school, it's good for life, and it's good until the last breath in our body.
And I want everybody thinking about questions here. Don't be shy. So what about the contact and what happened when you ran into someone named Ted Sizer?
Well, when we got this idea of starting a secondary school, I had just read in Ed Week. He wrote an article that was before the book Horace's Compromise came out. Mm-hmm. He wrote an essay in Ed Week. And it was the first time I had ever seen an essay describe high school the way I thought about elementary school.
I see.
And he had a big name, and he was important, mm-hmm. capital I. And so I thought that that if he could help us start the secondary school, he could go to the authorities, the chancellors, and say that Deborah Meier should be able to start a secondary school. Because I was licensed as a kindergarten teacher. So there was a certain skepticism about why I thought I could start a high school. And so I called someone at Harvard, who I knew slightly from the North Dakota Study Group, and said, do you think Ted Sizer could help me? And could you put a word into him that I'm a kindergarten teacher, but that I'm a special kindergarten teacher? And so she said, he's a very special person. You could call him directly. You don't need my intervention. And I called him, and he came down to East Harlem, and he went to see the chancellor, and we had fun together thinking about what a secondary school might look like in the kindergarten tradition. And you know what I most loved about that book, and if some of you haven't read it, you should, is that it was the first book one of the first books in which he was making a strong critique of schooling, and in a way of this Horace, but it was done with such respect for the dilemma Horace was in. It wasn't an attack on him, but a respectful examination of how a very good man could be caught by the structure of a school system to not be able to do what he knew good schooling should be about. And there was relatively few people in my experience in New York City who viewed teachers with people outside of the K-12 system who viewed teachers with real respect. And I had a certain hostility towards the academia because it seemed to me that, someone who was a historian at Columbia didn't assume that he was in the same profession as a high school teacher who was teaching history. And so the whole way in which we viewed the hierarchical systems in which we thought about other human beings was so, I thought, disrespectful. And as John Dewey had said, and I knew this from before I became interested in education, because John Dewey was actually also a political man, and one of his points was that that education had always been to teach the ruling class how to rule. That was the historic purpose of education, at least in the Western world, and in the Asian world too. That was the purpose of education. It was to sustain and maintain the elitism of a ruling class. And he said, if everybody in a democracy, we're assuming everybody is a member of the ruling class, in which case everybody needs the education of a ruling class. And that has been my motto.
And as I still wait for a hand, my last one, and then a hand, Ted at the time in Horace wrote, "You can tell the most about a school without going into it if you know the social composition of the students."
Yep. So I was, among other things, a socialist. So it was clear to me that Marx was right about some things. One of which was that we have a class system, and some people were not intended to be members of the ruling class. And that there's so many things about starting with 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds about the way society looks at them that we take for granted that some people are not members of the ruling class. And so this question of democracy, the question of what does it mean to say we're for democracy, and that that we went to war, World War I was a little before my time, but that was a war for democracy. World War II was in my time, and it was a war for democracy. And then came the Cold War, and it was a war for democracy. And it struck me that where did we think people experienced what that word meant? Because we spend the first 12, families are certainly not naturally democratic. And once you hit school at around 4 or 5, you're in school for the next 18 or 20 years. And certainly schools are one of the most hierarchical, authoritarian institutions in the country. They're in many ways more authoritarian, I think, than the army or the factory. In part because, of course, there's the age difference, among other things, that makes it easier to humiliate children. And that it seemed to me highly unlikely that if that was how we were raised for the first 18X years, that we would have any idea of what it is about democracy, that what it was like, what it was for, and what it was in fact at all. And that the one thing different about private education, even non-progressive private education and public education, based on this experience I had, was that we raised one set of children very differently than we raised the other set. And even the most privileged children had relatively little experience with the idea of democracy. And it's a peculiar idea. We're not naturally born to be Democrats. I think the default position of humans is hierarchical. And the struggle to develop what a democracy might be like, and all the trade-offs and complexity of what it means to try to honor freedom and fairness for all is intellectually fascinating. And there is no place in which we may learn about how you pass a law in a civics course, but there's no place where we really explore the incredible dilemma of the idea of democracy and how much it presumes about our equality. It's not, the Greeks developed the term, the word democracy, but they assumed that women shouldn't vote because, for a very good reason, they weren't independent. They weren't equal, and democracy only works among equals. And we have tried very hard to have a democracy in this country without trying very hard to create a society of equals.
Question. Are we going to wait? Thank you.
Thank you, yes.
So I was just looking through for Debbie and for Larry as well. Your book is Schools We Trust, and I was looking specifically at the chapter about standardization versus standards, and I was wondering if either of you feel that there is a valuable purpose to any standardized testing, and there's always this debate as to whether we should continue with the standardized testing or not. So I was wondering your opinion on that. And for those of us who don't feel it's valuable, how do we have that conversation with district officials? And what do I tell my students if they're forced to do this to try to legitimize the time and energy?
It isn't legitimate. So I don't know any way you can convince kids. And in fact, I kind of like trying to convince them it isn't, so they won't take too seriously their scores, whether they're high or low. And yeah, there's things, as a classroom teacher, you decide as much for your own information as for the students' information, sometimes to give everybody the same set of questions and look at what their answers are. And you and the students between you may even decide what stakes it will have. But these tests are designed after the IQ test, and I think some of you should get some expertise on what the design of the IQ test was and what lies behind the IQ test. And it is a thoroughly undemocratic concept that lies behind IQ tests. So how do they know whether I answer B and you answer C? How do they know which is the right answer? Well, the people who developed the IQ test said if a doctor gets it right and a mechanic gets it wrong, that's a good item. If it's the reverse way around, it's a bad item and we're going to throw it out. And ETS has a basement, I don't know if it's a basement actually, a huge room which has a pool of all the questions that they have studied. They sample people with questions and decide how hard a question is and who gets it right and who gets it wrong. And there are quite a lot of questions which people of color get right and white people get wrong. And those are items they never use. And because they think it improperly differentiates. There's an assumption behind that, right? That
So Vicki Abellis you saw one of her films last night. She did another film called Race to Nowhere about that very topic. What about, well, first of all, in standardized tests is the word standards. Well, standards is that's a
different questions.
that's a different question about standards.
They have to have the same
they,
origin.
yes, but
There's
this suggestion about standards that you need to be serious and have standards and have expectations about expectations. And maybe is expectations a safer word than standards, because standards leads to standardization, and standardization is perhaps the death knell of innovation.
Well, expectation doesn't quite get it either. And standards is something that seems to me that you have to agree to. You have to accept it. If someone says, that doesn't meet my standard for a good dance or a good book or a good mural, and someone else can say it does meet my standard. So you can't impose standards. But so it has a different meaning.
Right. So those who know me know that I'm now going to read a single sentence called Campbell's Law, because we were actually talking about Campbell's Law while we walked over here, and she's one of the few people that knew Campbell's Law when I first mentioned it. Don Campbell was a sociology professor in the 70s in University of Michigan, and he coined this single term. There's an entire Wikipedia entrance just about this sentence. So the sentence itself is, the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. What's your take on that?
I think it's perfect. I love it. And it's so obviously true. And we watch it distort and corrupt. And unfortunately, it corrupted me, too. I mean, it's very hard if you have kids whose future is going to be determined by a test that you know is not a measure of what they can do and what their value is. And then you're faced with two choices. I could cheat and help them get a better score, or I could be an honorable person and not cheat and destroy their future. And if you live in a culture in which your principal and your parents and the superintendent and the local newspaper and the mayor all hope you cheat, it begins to be corrosive. And as you know, there was a woman named Beverly Hall who went to Atlanta. I knew her in New York, and I thought she was an honorable and good woman. She went to Atlanta, and her charge was to raise test scores. And she created a climate in Atlanta that led some people like me to cheat. And those teachers were imprisoned. She went on. I'm not mad that she didn't get imprisoned too, in a way, but there is something unfair about the fact that Beverly Hall did not.
Right. Well, she also got cancer at the same time, so that kind of cut her short. But for those who don't know what happened in Atlanta in terms of standardized testing, is that somebody had this idea that since we use a scan, why do we have standardized testing? Because it's also very cheap. You know, you just run these things right through with A, B, C, D. And I took the bar exam, which is, I've always joked, is the ultimate standardized test. It's A, B, C. It's the same type of test. You don't write anything. It's all A, B, C, D. And so, and then, by the way, it's very important that people have learned that you have 4 choices, not 5 choices, but that's a whole other distraction. And so what happened was that someone figured out that if we have this machine, because it's inexpensive to run a gazillion sheets through and get scores, so we need to do something that's inexpensive to determine cheating, because there's so many millions of kids in the country, 50 million in public education, as a matter of fact, 10% of them in this state, 5 million. And so they had this idea that they would sensitize a Scantron machine to pick up erasures. And when it picked up erasures, they said, okay, I've got a fourth grader, and the fourth grader picked C and then erased C. What do we think if a fourth grader is unsure about C? What is the likelihood when they erase, they're going to get the right answer? Not 99 to 100%. And that's what started to happen. And the incentives were financial to fourth grade teachers in Atlanta, that they would get extra money if their kids had higher test scores, Campbell corruption pressures. And then what happened was the fifth grade teachers found out that the fourth grade teachers were having beer parties at night and changing kids' grades, which meant that the fifth grade teachers were not going to get the money because the fourth grade teachers already got it because they could not get better scores than the fourth grade kids did. So the fifth grade teachers started making phone calls about the fourth grade teachers, Campbell's Law, Campbell's Law. And we still have standardized tests. What about the word standards anyway? What, where'd that come from? Where's it going?
The flag, right?
The flag? That's true. It's a standard. That is. You hold the standard up. That's true. Okay. It's an expectation, right? Okay.
Well,
But
it's like the flag in a way. It's something you honor.
right. Yeah.
Well, we may not all honor it,
But yeah, So a question that you asked in the very interestingly named the beautician question: can secondary education be progressive? I remember, Rob. Remember we went into that vocational school when we went into the. Can I do it? So this school happened because we got a contract that a lot of us worked on, Ted Sizer, Howard Fuller, and the rest of us, called the New American High School, which led us to run around the country looking at, in particular, vocational technical schools. And Debbie asked a great question in this piece about Massachusetts banned beautician programs during my tenure there because the pay was so low to be a beautician. But the question that Debbie had asked was, why should a doctor be a better prepared citizen than a plumber? And as a carpenter, I really kind of appreciate that. And I also went to law school, so I kind of did both. So let's go back to what happened when that particular day the principal was really thrilled that we had come to visit her school. And she said we had to see the new beautician program. Now, first, what?
The beauty parlor.
The beauty parlor. Now, one curious thing about having gone around the country looking at vocational schools is that beautician programs' walls are painted pink, which doesn't really happen in most other ones. Just factor that in there. So we went there, and there's a window at the door, but it was pitch black inside, and she was a little bit startled that nothing was going on in there, and we didn't know what, and she was embarrassed, and we were trying to have her not be embarrassed because we didn't know what it was. Anyway, she said, well, but it's a beautiful new facility, so I've got to show it to you. So she took out her key, and she opened the door, and we went inside, and there were two young women, students, who were sitting in there in abject darkness, chatting with each other. And of course, she was very embarrassed, and she said, what's going on? And one of them said, our teacher's out again today. And then there was this long, squirmish pause, and then the other one said, but she's really sick this time. Not one of our better moments.
But the idea that the beautician, by the way, I came up with beautician because a lot of the girls in my school wanted to be beauticians. And they were generally discouraged. You know, someone would say, well, you could also be a doctor. And they said, no, I want to be a beautician. I love cutting people's hair and styling them and so forth. And I was intrigued by how accustomed we were to putting down our youngsters whose ambitions were just as socially useful. If he had said, I want to be a banker, we wouldn't have said, put him down. And the banker may be less useful than a beautician. But the class prejudices that went into the ordinary conversation that we have with students in schools. And I thought, well, she has one vote and the doctor has one vote. Why are we assuming that she doesn't need as good an education as he does?
So another question for you, because when we started just about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, there was Rob, me, and Ben. I think I saw Janie. Of the 8 or 10 people that first founded our schools, I think there are four of them are here, maybe 5. You made a jump from having one school to doing multiple schools, correct? And I would like to know about the good, the bad, and the challenges of having multiple rather than one single school.
Well, we didn't actually do it to have multiple schools. We did it because I couldn't see any reason why there should be a waiting list to get into our school. And by the way, there is a reason to have a waiting list, as you know, some of you. Some schools brag about how big their waiting list is. There's only 4 spaces and we have 100 applicants for 4 spaces. I think that's shameful that there should be 100 applicants for 4 spaces. We ought to have 25 times as many such schools then. So I didn't see any reason why, if parents wanted their kids to come to our school, we shouldn't start other schools like it. And in the beginning, the 3 schools were very much, we made a point that they were very much alike. And that, in fact, you couldn't apply for one of them. You had to apply, and I don't know how you do that here. You had to apply just for one of the Central Park East schools. And then if you had a special reason because of location or something else, you could explain why one of the 3 was better than the other. And we met together and we made it hard. We did our budgets together so that one wasn't a wealthier school than the other. So on the other hand, I also thought that over time we should be different, because a school is a group of people who have ideas, and sometimes they have another idea, and it's a different one than you had over in CP1 and CP2. And I felt that in fact, we should over time get to look like 3 different schools, and therefore couldn't probably just place children willy-nilly in one or the other. And that is also something I felt strongly about, that the constituents of a school should be thoughtful human beings who make decisions together. And since we're no 2 of us alike, it's not likely that any 2 schools will make all those same decisions. And that was an advantage for our ideas, to show people that it could be carried out in many different ways. And the secondary school, again, was just because parents were upset about the fact that there was no follow-through from our elementary schools. Now, it's true, there was a point in New York City when we were very popular, and lots of other schools like ours started, both elementary and some secondary schools. Some big high schools were broken up into smaller secondary schools. And it's too long a story, but we had a moment in New York. I'm trying to remember what year it was, but the late 80s, 1980, when I thought that we were going to take over the world. And then another train we discovered was coming down the track, and No Child Left Behind.
No child left behind. Yeah. Oh.
Hi, over here. I've been a big fan of your books for a long time, and I'm wondering if you have any words of advice or wisdom or inspiration for those of us in a profession that is constantly being told what to do by people who are not in our profession. And as we are soon to be led by someone who has literally no experience in our profession, how do we stay inspired? Because I find it hard to believe that a doctor would remain in the profession of being a doctor, being told to do something by, say, I don't know, a dentist. So I'm just curious, as your experience, if there's any inspiration you can give us at this moment in time.
Well, you've answered your own question, of course. You can't possibly educate children to be thoughtful citizens or thoughtful scientists or thoughtful anything by a bunch of non-thoughtful teachers who, in fact, not only are not thoughtful, but are not allowed to be thoughtful, and who are, more or less honored for being as robotic as they can, who are given scripts. And there's such a contradiction in the concept that now, so what do we do about that? Well, for most of history, I don't know how to put this. Partly, if people are powerless, and I'm speaking of children or teachers or parents, we forget they have one power that hard to take away, and that is they can sabotage us. And I think the American teachers, this is not totally new, this scripting it, but one of the things that good teachers always did was they closed the door and they did something different. So when I first started teaching, I was teaching a kindergarten and half day, and the city said that I was supposed to teach these Chicago 5-year-olds. The curriculum in the fall was supposed to be to compare Los Angeles and Tokyo. Now, you might try to think of where did that idea come from, that these 5-year-olds needed to know more about the differences and the similarities between Tokyo and Los Angeles. I've often wondered where that idea did come from. I never found out. Anyway, I wanted to be a little compliant, so I thought, well, we'll study Tokyo, because we also had a principal whose ancestry was Japanese, and he was gung-ho to help me make Japan come alive. And we'll study Tokyo and Chicago. That was being a little rebellious. And so we had a marvelous time, and then near the end of that semester, a woman came from downtown to visit my kindergarten, and she called me out of the room after she looked around and said, you're supposed to be studying Los Angeles and Tokyo. And I tried to explain to her that after all, in Chicago, we could go out and look at Chicago, and anyway, we argued for a while, and then she said, and also I notice on your blackboard that you haven't paid attention to the rules. You were supposed to have a list of what we do and children do in Tokyo, and a list of what children do in Los Angeles, and to point out that it's the same. Children in Tokyo wake up in the morning to eat breakfast. Children in Los Angeles wake up in the morning and eat breakfast, and so forth and so on. And but you have all kinds of differences up there about all they do things differently in Japan, in Tokyo, than they do in Chicago. And I said, we're now out in the hall talking in very loud voices. And I said, I would like to do this curriculum in such a way they would like to go to visit Tokyo. And if it's exactly the same as Chicago, why should they go all the way across the ocean to see Japan? And she said, no, we're trying to teach tolerance. Don't you see? You're not understanding. The purpose of this curriculum is to teach tolerance. It was, any case, by this time we were obviously on different paths, and she stormed out of the building. And all the doors opened on the floor of the other teachers, and they all came running over to me and said, that was fascinating. But you have to understand how you do things like that. When someone like that comes in, you say, oh, I'm sorry, I must have misread the directions. And, oh, I'm so glad you told me about that. And so they gave me the script. And then they said, she'll go away, she'll never come back. And you can go on teaching about Chicago and Tokyo. And part of me thought, that's a good idea. Another part of me thought, do I want to spend the rest of my life hiding what we do rather than celebrating and showing off what we do? And so that's my dilemma. I know how you can get away with some things, but, and I think it's harder to get away with them today. I remember when they decided to put a fax machine in the high school, and I was so regretful because before the fax machine, they had to mail things to us. And it was easy to say, we never got it. Anyway, so it's harder, I think, today to get away, close the door and get away with it. There are all these people called coaches who are monitoring you and so forth. But it's also, we can't learn from each other, and we can't model what it is like to be thoughtful adults to children if we have to hide our work. So I don't know the answer. And that's why I'm glad. I'm not a fan in some ways of charter schools, but for those people who have figured out a way to use charters for the purpose of allowing teachers and children and parents to be more thoughtful, I'm for them. And that may be what you have to do.
Well, perhaps to build on that, I'd love to know, both you and Larry have the very interesting experiences of working within established schools, but also working within and leading schools that you've created. And those are two very different endeavors in some ways. And I'd love to build on what you're talking about here and ask you a little bit about, for those who are leading, whether in an established school or perhaps in something that's emerging, what are some of the things that have really struck you both about leading this work and helping not only how did you remain inspired, but what did you bring to that work and to the others around you that you felt was really constructive and helpful in bringing about the kinds of schools and the kinds of experiences for kids that you really envisioned?
Well, when I got this chance to, first of all, I just say I came into being a teacher when I was in my mid-30s. And I think it was an enormous advantage. I'm not saying you should all do that. But I think it was an enormous advantage. I had already done other things. I already thought of myself as an adult who had a lot of experience in the world. And the principals were not, I felt more as an equal with the principals. They didn't intimidate me, and I was always infuriated when I would go into the school in New York. And the school I was in Chicago, it happened there were a lot of people like me. But the school in New York that I went to, the young teachers would gather in the morning, and one would say to the other, is Miss Spiro, that's the principal, is she in a good mood this morning? And don't talk to her now because this is not the right day to talk to her. And it reminded me of how my brother and I might talk about my mother, Let's not ask mother whether we can do this today because she's in a bad mood. And the infantilization of the teaching profession, and especially in elementary schools. So I think some of the opportunities that probably Larry and I had was because it didn't occur to us that we couldn't do what we wanted to do. It never occurred to me to ask permission to change from Los Angeles to Chicago. I assumed that as an intelligent, grown-up woman, I could do what I thought was right. And I think that schools of education do a very poor job preparing people for being that kind of adults. And of course, it's true that in a sense, the whole educational system doesn't prepare kids for having that sense of their own agency when they grow up. And you have to practice it out some places, but I think that the big advantage I had was, one, that I liked my colleagues. So I always brought colleagues, the school was never started by me. It was started by a bunch of us. And since I had no experience being a high school teacher, that was especially true in the secondary school. I found people who were secondary school teachers who felt the same way about their jobs, and I said, let's do this together. And I think in that respect, was your experience similar?
Oh yeah, pretty much. I mean, I just remember one administrator in particular that I had, and it was kind of what you said. When he would come by and tell me to do something, I'd say, "Oh yeah, sure, got it covered," and then would do something else. So, but so I think that creative non-compliance is a very effective mechanism to use sometimes. But I think that when you are trying to do progressive things in schools that don't really want you doing progressive things, that actually you can get away with doing a lot of progressive things. I just don't, they don't stop you as much as I think that some of us think that they do. And I see a lot of people nodding to that. You just do it, And if kids are thriving and kids are happy, and then their parents are happy because their kids are thriving, nobody bothers you, really. I mean, and that's what we're trying to do in the first place. So that's kind of what I think.
No, that's this question of getting away with. It's also true that frequently principals want you to. I remember one time a music teacher, I was teaching a course at City College while I was at New York City schools, and a woman came in the course and she said, I don't know what to do. I'm a music teacher and I just discovered that I've been teaching children the fourth grade songs in third grade, and I was supposed to teach them third grade songs. And I said, I didn't even know there was third grade songs and fourth grade songs. So I said, so what are you worrying about? She said, someone may come in and find out that I'm teaching fourth grade songs to third graders. And I said, so on that day, you tell them, today we decided to try out a few fourth grade songs. And now the other thing I would say was, and besides which, the time to give in, to compromise, is when they're actually about to fire you. And you have to decide then, can you afford to raise your children if they fire you? I mean, there are real consequences, but don't censor yourself ahead of time. Wait till the moment when you have to decide one way or the other, whether it's worth teaching fourth grade songs to third graders. But isn't it amazing how they manage to think, could you tell a fourth grade song from a third grade song?
That's a great moment for our time to run out, because nobody has an answer to that very excellent question, nor could they ever. Thanks, Debbie, so much for being here, really.